Hey everyone. On Sunday, we talked about the burden of stuff. And there were a couple of thoughts that I didn't have enough time to get to, and so I wanted to share those with you now. What I want to do first is just to kind of set it all back up. I want to go back to Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19. We're going to read that again together. So, Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19. Don't collect for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but collect for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. In other words, where you're investing your time and your energy and your financial resource and all of those things, that is where your heart is. Where you invest in that treasure, that is where your heart follows. Verse 22, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light within you is darkness, how deep is that darkness? No one can be a slave of two masters, since either he will hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot be slaves of God and of money. You know, it seems that the world is also coming around to this idea that stuff really is a burden. There's a huge movement of people to live more minimally and live in small little, the tiny house movement and all of that. But recently there was actually an article in the Huffington Post talking about this, entitled "The Burden of Stuff: Why Less May Actually Make You Happier." And in the article, they spend time with a couple formerly from Phoenix, Arizona, named Rodda and Brad Linton. Rodda and Brad had decided that stuff was too much. They had a wonderful home with a backyard pool and a BMW M3. They had all this stuff, but just the burden of the maintaining of all of it began to get to them, and they just started to let things go. They started to sell whatever they could on Craigslist or eBay or wherever they could get rid of it to just lighten their load. And then they moved from a nice big house in Phoenix, Arizona. They moved to Fort Collins, Colorado to pursue a simpler, quieter kind of lifestyle, if you will. And here's what they had to say in the interview on the topic when Brad was asked about it. He talked a little bit about excess baggage. He said this: I look at every item I own as a burden. And if I'm going to keep an item, the happiness it gives me must be worth the burden. The burdens include cleaning, maintaining, moving, insuring, and just worrying about an item. They all seem like small things, but they add up. So the maintenance and the worry and the insuring of a BMW M3 just got to the point of, it's too much. I don't want to maintain. I don't want the burden of this. I don't want the worry of this. He said just the appeal of the car was nice. He loved it. But the appeal of it was how it looked. And he said just the maintaining and the washing it nonstop, he said, even drove him a little bit crazy. He did talk about how he still likes nice things. He says this later in the interview: I don't want to own nice things, but I want to use nice things. For example, I like the idea of going and renting a Porsche and driving up US Highway 1 from San Francisco to Portland. I think that would be great, but I don't want to own a Porsche. I want to rent a Porsche and have an awesome road trip with it, but I do not want to own it. I don't want the burden of owning it, the burden of more stuff, the burden of more insurance, the burden of... See, even the world is coming around to this idea that stuff is just it's a burden. But now here's where the world differs from Christianity. The Huffington Post article was all about your happiness. God's number one priority for your life is not happiness. God's number one priority for your life is holiness. That you're moving closer and closer to what God has for you in your life. And so in Matthew chapter 6, when we read, don't store up treasures for yourselves. Don't get a bunch of stuff. Don't leave your treasure here where moth and rust destroy. Rust is going to destroy your car eventually. Will destroy clothes eventually. Everything is going to be destroyed. Don't store up there. Store up treasures in heaven. Why? For what purpose? Jesus concludes this part of his message in verse 33 when he says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these other things will be provided for you." You see, the difference between the Christian worldview on stuff and the world's kind of view on stuff is that the world says less stuff and you will be happier. And that is true. As a Christian, I would say the same. With less, you will be happier because you have less burden. But the purpose of having less stuff, the reason why we should want to have less stuff, is not for our happiness. It is actually so that our hearts and our minds and every ounce of energy we have can be aimed and focused and put toward the pursuit of the kingdom of God. Seek first the kingdom of God above all else, and all this other stuff will be added. You'll get the stuff you need along the way, but don't put your heart and your soul into earthly treasures that are just going to fall apart. So I think ultimately there is an ounce of this where part of it is that you will be happier with less burden. You will walk more lightly. You will travel better. Life will be better for you. But the ultimate purpose of it is so that you can focus that energy into the kingdom of God, into making disciples, into being a part of the mission that God has for the church. So here's my encouragement for you. My encouragement is to walk through your house and start making that list of all those things maybe that need to go. And just start writing some of that down and start to see how much stuff you really have. Kind of take an inventory of all the things, right? And then spend a little bit of time in prayer, maybe in community with another believer that you trust, and say, I really have this sense that these things are keeping me from what God may ultimately have for me. I need to let some things go. Would you help me walk through that process? So for you, maybe one of your next steps is to get into online community, to gather into a group with other believers and say, I just need some help processing through some of this as I begin to release things for the purpose of the kingdom of God, seeking his mission for me first. Maybe for you along the way, it's just you kind of already know some of this instinctively as a believer, and for you it's just taking that list of stuff and beginning to move forward and starting to let some things go and lighten the load a little bit and let go of the mental worry and the distraction and the generational burden and worry of all this stuff and where's it going to go and who's going to deal with this. But you could begin to let those things go and move closer and closer and closer to the kingdom of God and his righteousness and what God has for you. And in that, you will find purpose. You will find joy. So my hope and prayer for you is that you discover that you see that the kingdom of God is absolutely worth it, that you begin to lighten the load, you let go of some stuff, and you focus your heart and your soul and your mind, everything that you have, on the eternal purposes of God, and that you would seek first his kingdom.